So this is 1 Corinthians 14, the scripture from March 23rd. And there's a lot of talk in this chapter about tongues. Paul talks about tongues and prophecy. And since we discussed prophecy a little bit a couple days ago, I'd like to spend some time with tongues today. So scholars have a ton of different ideas as to what tongues and it actually is, according to Paul here. And some think, maybe it's the ability that some folks have to just pick up languages like that, where one day you're speaking English, but the next day somehow you understand German or you understand Mandarin or Taiwanese or something. And, that makes sense. That's something that we've seen Christians, particularly missionaries, be gifted at. Other scholars look back to Acts chapter 2, during the time of Pentecost, where the believers were gathered together and all of a sudden everybody could understand what these believers were saying, and they understood it in their own first language, which is just an incredible spiritual gift to have. And while that may well be the case now in the modern day as well, I've not seen that happen, but maybe it still happens. I think both of these have been floated as possibilities for what Paul's talking about in 1 Corinthians 14. But in the chapter, Paul says that not every tongue is intelligible in verse 9. And he also says that those who pray in tongues pray in the Spirit. And so because of that, that's in verse 14. Because of that, I'm tempted to understand what Paul's talking about not as a human language necessarily, but as a heavenly language. Some scholars call it an ecstatic language, a language that is only understood by God. And this is why when people pray in tongues, their spirit is active, but their mind is not, because their mind doesn't understand what's going on. Now, to be clear, the other ways of understanding the gifts of tongues, that may very well be how tongues has manifested itself in our modern age. But how Paul understood it, I think, may be closer to that of a heavenly language of sorts. Now, you may have heard of some charismatic or Pentecostal churches who insist that every believer must speak in tongues, that this is evidence of the baptism of the Holy Spirit, is what some of them call this. Now, not every Pentecostal or charismatic church holds to this line. Some just welcome tongues as one of the spiritual gifts. And we as Presbyterians, I think, could do to learn from that. We tend not to emphasize tongues at all because to us it doesn't play well with how we understand church. So those who do insist that you speak in tongues and that's evidence of your salvation, I just don't see how you can get that from this passage here. I don't see how you can get that from Paul's argument. I think it actually runs totally counter to what Paul's saying, because Paul says that some of us have this spiritual gift, others have that. And so if everybody needed to speak in tongues, well, then everybody would have that spiritual gift, and that's just not what Paul's saying here. What Paul does say, though, is that those who have this gift, if you do speak in tongues, you shouldn't speak in church unless you have an interpreter. That's in part because if you speak without an interpreter, it's chaotic. People are speaking and nobody has any idea what's going on. Tongues tend to isolate individuals when there's nobody to interpret what's being said. Whereas prophecy edifies a community, which is why in church, prophecy is, smiled on, whereas tongues generally are not. This also, I think, is at the root for what Paul says about women being silent in the church. This is toward the end of the chapter, and this has to do with the context of the time, I think, is maybe the best place to start. So men and women would sit separately in the church when they would congregate to worship at that time. They would sit different sides of the sanctuary or the synagogue. And so what would sometimes happen is if a woman didn't understand what was going on, either because they didn't train women to be literate or in the niceties of philosophy at that time in that place, she would yell across the way to her husband and say, "Hey, could you explain this to me?" And that would lead to a ton of crosstalk and a ton of people speaking over one another, which is the opposite of what Paul's trying to get the church to do. Clearly, this would be disorderly. And Paul says at the very end of this chapter that everything should be done decently and in order. So for this reason, Paul commands women not to speak in the church. And this clearly isn't a blanket command. And if you're going to be consistent in how you read Paul, you can't read this as a blanket command, because just a few chapters ago, Paul talked about how women pray and prophesy in the church. And you can't do that silently. So for this particular context, it made sense for wives not to ask their husbands something in the church, but to ask when they got home. So there's a right time and a place, I think, for every spiritual practice and for stuff to happen within the church. But confusing the times for these practices can actually be as bad as not doing them at all or doing the opposite. So that's one of the reasons that Paul is so insistent that prophecy be given pride of place within the church when you gather, and that tongues sort of be subsumed under that. It's not that prophecy is a more important gift than tongues. It's that for the community, prophecy knits people together, whereas tongues tend to isolate individuals. I wonder, what's your perspective on tongues? Have you ever experienced someone speaking in tongues before? That's all for 1 Corinthians 14. Tomorrow, the 24th of March, we'll be looking at 1 Corinthians 15. May God bless you in your reading of Scripture.